One day, we will wake up to find that the energy that powers the alarm clock came from the breeze through the trees the night before. And we will go to work that morning riding the rays of the sun. It will light our cities and power our businesses. It will warm our homes and cool our workplaces. It will reduce sources of conflict and fuel our economies. It will connect us all. It won't scar the land or poison the seas. The food we eat will be good for our bodies and good for the planet. And the weather that day won't make us worry for tomorrow. There will be more jobs and less disease. The sea level will stop rising. And species will stop dying. The question is, how do we get to that day from where we are today?
India is officially known as the Republic of India and is one of the oldest civilizations in the world. The population is approximately 1.2 billion, with the capital city of New Delhi being home to 17.8 million people. Although New Delhi is the capital, the city of Mumbai, which is located on India's west coast, is home to 20.7 million people. India resides in South Asia and is the seventh largest country in the world, covering 3.3 million square kilometers. It holds its own geographical entity and it is bordered by the Himalayan mountains in the north and by the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, and the Indian Ocean to the south. India gained independence in 1947 from the United Kingdom, and in the last 69 years has achieved all-round socio-economic progress. India has become self-sufficient in agricultural production and is now one of the top industrialized countries in the world. The Indian government is a sovereign socialist secular democratic republic with a parliamentary form of government which is federal in structure with unitary features. India's federal government consists of three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. The executive branch of Indian government consists of the President, the Vice President, and the Council of Ministers. It is actually the Prime Minister who holds the most executive power and is responsible for advising the President on political issues. The legislative branch consists of the upper house called Rajya Sabha, which is represented by a council of states. The Rajya Sabha has 245 members whom are elected to represent their state. The members of the lower house, called Lok Sabha, are elected by popular vote to represent the people. The Lok Sabha has 545 members, 543 of whom are elected by popular vote to represent the people of India. The other two are chosen by the President to represent the Anglo-Indian community. The judicial unitary three-tier independent judiciary comprises the Supreme Court, headed by the Chief Justice of India, 24 high courts, and a large number of trial courts. The independent judiciary allows the courts to operate separate from the government. This ensures the courts are not improperly influenced by any branch of the government. The general public within India are able to communicate with their member of Lok Sabha, to represent them within the court system. Therefore, the government is accountable for the people of India. Broadly speaking, global effects of climate change can be summarized in three main areas. Firstly, a rise in the surface temperature of the Earth of anywhere between 1.1 and 6.4 degrees can be expected over the next 100 years. Secondly, more extreme weather patterns of hot and cold temperatures is expected. And thirdly, sea levels are expected to continue to rise. This will especially affect India in terms of health and agriculture. These two areas clearly encompass most of the country's existence, with health encompassing things like physical and mental health and the development of a productive culture, and agriculture including the Indian economy and the livelihood of local populations. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has identified 3 factors that place a country most at risk of climate change effects on health. These are having a developing population, arid and high mountain zones, and densely populated coastal areas. Shockingly, India has all 3 of these elements, being a developing country with a Himalayan mountain range and a densely populated southern coast. This places India at a clearly pronounced risk of the negative effects of climate change on health. Such effects include direct threats, such as deaths from natural disasters and weather patterns. Additionally, indirect effects exist. For example, diseases carried in water, food, and insects, resulting from the direct impacts listed above. Agriculture provides India not only with main food sources for local populations, but also significant economic prosperity. However, the effects of climate change on this are already obvious and only expected to worsen. Studies show a 36% impact of climate change on wheat production in India, and a decrease of approximately 20% on rice production. These sources of food and income are absolutely vital for the approximately 700 million people living in rural India, along with indirect effects reaching out to the rest of the country. It is therefore clear that climate change will continue to have drastic effects on our country and urgently needs to be addressed. Although India is one of the most polluted countries in the world and lacks the money and manpower to really tackle the pollution issue properly, studies by the CSE, or Centre for Science and Environment, show that India cannot be held accountable for any of the carbon or methane in our atmosphere. Although as a nation, India is developing rapidly in both its population and economy, when compared to developed countries like the United States, they have not produced anywhere near as much waste in the atmosphere. Research conducted by the WRI, or World Resources Institute, a Washington-based research group, is said by Agarwal and Narain to be based less on science and more on politically motivated and mathematical jugglery. As shown in the graphs, the WRI calculated that India and China combined are responsible for 10.3% of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere of Earth, whereas the CSE found that India and China are responsible for only 0.6%. The research conducted by the WRI focused mainly on CO2 produced from deforestation and methane from rice fields and livestock, barely putting emphasis on greenhouse gases produced from the burning of fossil fuels, such as oil and coal. Graphs compiled by the CSE using the same data, but viewed perhaps more fairly, show that India has not contributed any excess emissions above the permissible emissions each country is expected to create. In fact, India in 2011 had 482 million tons of permissible carbon emissions that they had not used up. The research by the WRI appears to be using the data in a way that makes developing countries appear that they have played a larger role in contributing to climate change than they actually have. The majority of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere are the fault of gargantuan consumption of the developed countries, particularly the United States. It appears that developing countries must undertake their own research in these areas to avoid unfair blame and bullying from more powerful and developed countries. Regarding greenhouse gas emitters, India is the 3rd largest emitter in the world, following the US and China. This is because India is a large country with many poverty-struck areas and a lack of government control to address complicated weather systems. However, India have recently made some large efforts in fixing this widespread issue, where they have made a national pledge to reduce the country's use of emissions by 2030. In order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, a coal tax was introduced in 2014, which raised over $2 billion for India's Clean Energy Fund. The tax rose from 80 cents per tonne to $3.20 per tonne in 2015. This solution is evidently effective in reducing climate change, as it deters the use of coal, consequently reducing coal emissions and improving the livelihood of the planet. India suspects to experience a rapid growth of population by 2030, believing to increase from 1.2 to 1.5 billion people. With such increase of population comes an increase in poverty. Therefore, India have developed a driven focus on renewable energy sectors, which effectively addresses intensifying CO2 emissions within the country. These distributed renewables have the ability to spread to remote areas in India, therefore electrifying further than just the metropolitan areas of India, and simultaneously creating energy security ambitions by the government. With half of the population depending on agriculture and other climate-sensitive sectors, India is one of the world's most vulnerable countries to climate change. Adding to the issue, about 76% of the Indian population lives on less than $2 a day. Studies have found the levels of poverty in some Indian states are as acute as those in some of the poorest African countries. Additionally, over 400 million people living in India live without electricity, and 75% of the population rely on biomass as cooking fuel. Financially speaking, India is too poor to redirect its resources away from poverty reduction and economic development. Electricity enables literacy, healthcare, immunization, safe water, sanitation, and allows Indian children to do their schoolwork, which would enable India to improve its human development indicators. India is currently ranked at number 128, next only to sub-Saharan Africa. The life expectancy for Indians at birth is 63.2 years, and the adult literacy rate is 61%. No country has improved its level of human development without a corresponding increase in per capita use of energy, and India has a huge development impact. While agriculture accounts for a large percentage of GHG emissions, around 60% of India's workforce is in agriculture. Inventory of GHG emissions include livestock, rice cultivation, crop soils, livestock manure, and crop residue burning. Rice is a staple food in India for over half the population. India is home to some of the most underfed and undernourished children in the world, and faces major problems if productions in agriculture are slowed down. In an attempt to combat the increasing impacts of climate change, India has formed alliances with some of the other stakeholders. India has a long-standing bilateral partnership with the European Union. As one of the leaders in climate change negotiations, the EU has established an initiative known as the Global Climate Change Alliance to increase communication and cooperation of developed and developing countries to ensure that the most vulnerable, least developed countries can adapt efficiently to the effects of climate change. India is a representative member of this alliance and is actively engaged with the sharing of knowledge to facilitate development plans for a more sustainable future, and is accepting of the decisions made by the board. While India and the EU have differing opinions about emission cut targets, with India believing they could be much lower if consumption was legally restricted, both parties do cooperate in other areas like clean technologies such as solar power, recycling, and renewable energy, and research and development. While India agrees with the plans made within this relationship and the relationship between developed and developing countries, India is still plagued with the financial burden of implementing these initiatives. Although developed countries and political bodies like the EU have assisted developing countries in some ways, they are still yet to provide enough funding for the plans to be put into action. If enough funding was provided for the known practices and technologies, India could nearly halve its carbon emissions by 2030. India maintains that these technologies should be declared global public goods and should be provided to developing countries for free or at an affordable cost, given the advantage of this seems to outweigh the initial cost for developed countries. India has a similar relationship with the developed countries within the present stakeholders, such as the United States and Australia, having formed alliances while still attempting to address the issues that divide the developed and developing countries like India and China. India has a strong relationship with China, and this alliance assists in the communication and collaboration between the developed and developing countries. India recognizes the efforts of the developed countries, however, still insists that more can and should be done with the effects of climate change imminent and overbearing, not only for India, but for other developing and least developed countries, whom India understands are incapable of adapting without the assistance and restraint of the more wealthy and consumptive countries. The business and industry non-government organizations in India are supportive of India's pledge to never exceed the per capita emission of the industrialized countries, and cooperate accordingly. However, India's relationship with other NGOs such as Greenpeace are not as cooperative or healthy. The Indian government shut down India's Greenpeace branch due to the understanding that it was working against the country's interests. While India supports clean and environmentally friendly technologies, the population needs to be maintained, and implementing everything the environmental NGOs advocate for would be unrealistic and not economically viable. In summary, it is evident that climate change is a gradual occurring phenomenon which over time will only lead to the further destruction of the environment and consequently harm those who live on Earth. As it is apparent, there is clearly evidence that suggests India is a large contributor of greenhouse gases. Though on the contrary, this can be seen as inconclusive, as gathered evidence also suggests the data is not correct and is exaggerated when compared between research by the WRI and CSE. Though this information can cause confusion, it is important as it indicates further research is required to truly know the extent of which India is a contributor. As we have learnt, India is considered a country most at risk of negative effects on health due to climate change because of their developing population status, Himalayan mountain range, and heavily populated southern coast. It is expected that India will face direct and indirect threats to health that are likely to result in the death of civilians. It is important to note that if agriculture is the primary cause of GHG emissions in India, any reduction will cause people to be unable to support their livelihood and further worsen the poverty within India. Realizations like this are important because they show that India is in need of more funding in order to sustain their environment, as well as the people within it, without compromising one for the other. Thus, they are in need to help find a balanced solution to this problem. It is known that India is within alliance with other stakeholders and doing their best to create a more sustainable future by supporting recycling, solar power use, and renewable energy. However, due to their financial burden and lack of funding, they are not able to become as sustainable as they would like to be. In conclusion, it is evident to see that India is making changes to limit how much greenhouse gases they emit yearly. This is important because as India is the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases, by reducing the amount they contribute, this will largely affect the amount of GHG that are emitted yearly in total of all countries. This aim and hope is important as it could be a large factor which could encourage other countries to make changes that will contribute to lowering greenhouse gases and creating a more sustainable and healthy environment.